And one of the things I learned from you is that in Orlando, it turns out it's a trend in the United States, but apparently in Orlando, you see it with your own eyes. People are actually leaving the church as an institution, going to church much less. What do you think was going on there, and what opened your eyes to that? Was it anecdotal, or was it scholarship from the start?
It definitely started anecdotally. We began to see that the majority of the people who we interact with in Orlando who don't go to church used to go to church. We then did see a Barna study that made the case that Orlando had the same percentage of evangelicals as New York City and Seattle, which really hit us. Like New York City and Seattle, the cultures of those cities feel so different than Orlando, Florida. How could we have the same percentage of evangelicals? But then it's like our anecdotal experience began to make sense of what we were hearing, because the majority of the people here still carry with them biblical knowledge, biblical foundation, in many cases seem to very much be Christians, embrace Christianity and Jesus. And so we began to look for more scholarship. We could not find it. My wife was actually in grad school at the time and wanted to do a research paper on dechurching. And the professor said, I'd love that, but you can't, there's nothing to research. So we then commissioned the largest nationwide quantitative, academically peer-reviewed study that has ever been performed, which may not sound that impressive once you know there was nothing, but it's a legit study. 7,000 participants, over 600 data points. We hired social scientist Ryan Burge to oversee this study. And our thesis was that this is not just an Orlando issue, that we could in fact be in the largest and fastest religious shift in the history of our country. And the study, in fact, definitively proved that we are.
And of course, the big question, and we'll spend some time talking about it, is why? What do you think's going on?
So that is the question. Up until recently, I think if your media or information diet is more to the left, you're going to hear that it's the church's problem. It's misogyny in the church, racism in the church, abuse in the church, scandal in the church. If your information intake is more from the right, you're going to hear the culture's problem. It's secular progressivism. It's the sexual revolution. These are the problems. What's fascinating is that both of these are right and both of these are wrong. So yes, you see both of those things as reasons for people who are leaving the church. But of the 40 million adult Americans who have left church in the last 25 to 30 years, that group, both of those stories only account for 10 million of the 40 million people. We call those the dechurched casualties. The lion's share, the 30 million, is what we call the casually dechurched. So the number one reason for dechurching in the United States is simply, I moved. Attendance was inconvenient, became a single parent. So the people in the left and the right articulating those stories, they're louder, they're loudest, so it can make it feel like that's the lion's share of what's going on. But the majority of the dechurching, like I said, is pedestrian, and the people experiencing that are dechurching unintentionally, and they're doing so more quietly.
If I just push you on that just for 1 second, though, it's interesting that that's a mundane story and has a happier valence to it, that it's just a mundane reason I moved. Well, people have been moving from one home to another for a long time. So I think that still doesn't account for why the phenomenon of now, why is it the last, say, decade, accounts for this level of purposeful migration, not to the church, but away from it. What do you think accounts for that, acknowledging that people have moved from one city to another for a long time?
Yeah, historically, we really have to focus on the 1990s. That's the inflection point for what's going on. Now, any social scientist worth his salt would argue that these inflection points don't come out of nowhere, and they would be right. We can go to 1776, we can go to theological liberalism, we can go to immigration, but that led up to the 1990s, four very important things happened that kicked this off. The first was the fall of the Soviet Union, and people don't realize how significant this is to lay the groundwork for dechurching before the end of the Cold War. I'm 44. You're younger than I am, but I can remember a time. I'm not sure if you can, when if someone were to say, "I am no longer a Christian," it wasn't uncommon for the next question to be, "Well, are you a communist?" I mean, because it was a battle between American Christianity and our godless atheist enemies. And it's no coincidence that under the Eisenhower administration is when we got "In God We Trust" on our money, under God on in our pledge. And so once the Soviet Union
Was it
fell,
that recent that it became, that was added to our pledge?
the Eisenhower administration, it was a part of Cold War propaganda. I mean, I'm not against those things, but that was what it was.
So that's actually an interesting fact. So under God was only added to our pledge under Eisenhower.
That's right.
And the same thing in our coins, in God we trust. Now,
That's right.
that was always part of the national, I suppose, seal and creed of the United States, right? You've had in God we trust for a long time, going back to our founding. But it's
we
the only
said
time
the phrase has been there, but we put it on our money.